Welcome. Tonight, we are going to talk about Cleopatra. In the gathering darkness of history, few figures shine with such enduring brilliance as the woman whose name has become synonymous with beauty, intelligence, and the fatal intersection of love and power. Tonight, as we settle into this quiet space together, we journey back more than 2,000 years to the banks of the Nile, to the final flickering flames of a civilization that had endured for 3 millennia, and to the woman who would be Egypt's last true sovereign, Cleopatra Sesotho, Cleopatra. Even her name carries the weight of dynasty and divine aspiration. Cleopatra means glory of her father, while Cleopatra declares her a lover of her father. She was the 7th queen to bear the name Cleopatra in the Ptolemaic dynasty, and she would be the last significant ruler of that line, the final chapter in a story that began when Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy, claimed Egypt as his prize after Alexander's death. But this is not merely a story of ending. It is a story of extraordinary intelligence, political acumen, and cultural sophistication. It is a story of a woman who spoke 9 languages, wrote treatises on medicine and mathematics, and commanded the loyalty of a nation. It is a story of passion that altered the course of empires, of choices made in the shadow of inevitable doom, and of a legacy that would outlive the very civilization she fought so desperately to preserve. As we move through this narrative together, let your mind drift back across the centuries to a world where Rome and Egypt stood as titans facing one another across the Mediterranean, where love affairs were matters of state, and where one woman's intelligence and charisma very nearly changed the shape of the ancient world. The world she was born into. To understand Cleopatra, we must first understand the Egypt into which she was born in 69 BCE. This was not the Egypt of the great pyramid builders, though those monuments still dominated the horizon at Giza. This was not the Egypt of the mighty pharaohs of the New Kingdom, though their temples still stood along the Nile. This was Ptolemaic Egypt, a curious hybrid civilization that had existed for nearly 3 centuries, blending Greek and Egyptian culture into something unique and magnificent. The story begins with Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king whose conquests reshaped the ancient world. In 332 BCE, Alexander had swept through Egypt, liberating it from Persian rule. The Egyptians, who had chafed under Persian domination, welcomed him as a liberator. Alexander paid respect to Egyptian traditions, visiting the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, where he was supposedly acknowledged as the son of the god. He founded the city that would bear his name, Alexandria, on Egypt's Mediterranean coast, and then moved on to further conquests. When Alexander died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BCE, his vast empire fractured, his generals, known to history as the Diadochi, or successors, carved up his domains. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, one of Alexander's most trusted companions, claimed Egypt. He was clever enough to recognize that Egypt's natural boundaries, desert to the west, desert and cataracts to the south, the Red Sea to the east, and the Mediterranean to the north, made it relatively easy to defend. He was also clever enough to steal Alexander's body during its funeral procession and bring it to Egypt, first to Memphis, and later to Alexandria, understanding the propaganda value of possessing the great conqueror's remains. Ptolemy of Nosota, as he would be known, established a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemies adopted many Egyptian traditions, presenting themselves as pharaohs to their Egyptian subjects while maintaining their Greek identity and culture. They married within the family to keep bloodlines pure and power consolidated, a practice that was both Greek, Macedonian, tradition and consistent with Egyptian royal customs. Alexandria became the jewel of this Ptolemaic realm. At its height, it was perhaps the greatest city in the Mediterranean world, rivaling even Rome. The famous Library of Alexandria, founded by Ptolemy the Thames and expanded by his successors, became the center of Hellenistic learning, housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls and attracting scholars from across the known world. The Mouseion, or museum, associated with the library, was the ancient world's premier research institution. The Pharaoh's Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guided ships into Alexandria's harbour. The city's wide streets were laid out in a grid pattern, its buildings were magnificent, and its cultural life was sophisticated and cosmopolitan. But by the time Cleopatra was born, this golden age was fading. The Ptolemaic dynasty had been weakened by internal strife, by the relentless cycle of palace intrigue and murder that seemed to afflict each generation. Brothers killed brothers, mothers poisoned sons, daughters overthrew fathers. The kingdom's wealth, once legendary, was being drained by military campaigns, by the need to pay tribute to Rome, and by the extravagance of the court. And Rome was the shadow that loomed over everything. The Roman Republic had been expanding inexorably for centuries. By the 1st century BCE, Rome dominated the Mediterranean, having defeated Carthage, conquered Greece and Macedonia, and absorbed the territories of the Seleucid Empire in the east. Egypt remained nominally independent, but it was a precarious independence. The Romans needed Egypt's grain to feed their growing population, and they eyed Egypt's wealth with undisguised desire. The Ptolemies survived by making themselves useful to Rome, by paying tribute, by providing military support when requested, by playing Roman factions against one another. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy Thoones. Auletes, the flute player, exemplified this precarious position. He had come to power through murky circumstances and spent much of his reign trying to secure Roman recognition of his legitimacy. He was eventually driven from Egypt by his own subjects, who resented his subservience to Rome and his heavy taxation. He fled to Rome and spent vast sums bribing Roman politicians to restore him to his throne. In 55 BCE, Aulus Gabinius, the Roman governor of Syria, invaded Egypt with his legions and reinstalled Ptolemy Thefoses. Among the young cavalry officers in this expedition was a man named Mark Antony, who would later play a crucial role in Cleopatra's life. This was the world into which Cleopatra was born, a world of faded glory and present danger, of immense wealth and mounting debts, of ancient tradition and foreign domination. She was born into the purple, a princess of the Ptolemaic house, but her position was far from secure. She had several siblings, and in the Ptolemaic dynasty, siblings were competitors, potential threats, to be eliminated rather than allies to be trusted. The education of a queen. What set Cleopatra apart from her ancestors, what made her exceptional among the Ptolemies, was not her beauty, though she was attractive. It was not her lineage, which was no more distinguished than that of any other Ptolemaic princess. It was her mind. The ancient sources tell us that Cleopatra was extraordinarily intelligent and exceptionally well educated. Plutarch, writing more than a century after her death, tells us that she spoke at least 9 languages fluently. Greek, of course, which was the language of her dynasty, but also Egyptian, which none of the previous Ptolemaic rulers had bothered to learn. She also spoke Aramaic, Hebrew, Syriac, Median, Parthian, and several other languages. This linguistic ability was not merely decorative, it was a tool of statecraft, allowing her to communicate directly with foreign ambassadors and her own subjects without interpreters, to read documents in their original languages, to present herself as a truly international monarch. Plutarch also tells us that her conversation was charming and sophisticated, that she had a voice described as like a lyre of many strings, and that her presence was irresistible. But beyond charm and presence, she possessed serious intellectual credentials. She wrote treatises on medicine, cosmetics, and weights and measures. She was interested in mathematics and philosophy. The palace at Alexandria contained one of the greatest libraries in the ancient world, and Cleopatra made full use of it. She received the education appropriate for a Hellenistic princess, which meant she was trained in rhetoric and philosophy, in literature and mathematics, in music and astronomy. She would have studied Homer and Hesiod, Herodotus and Thucydides. She would have learned about the great philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, the Stoics and Epicureans. She would have been taught the arts of persuasion and debate that were so important in Greek culture. But Cleopatra's education went beyond the standard Hellenistic curriculum. She deliberately learned Egyptian, both the spoken language and the ancient hieroglyphic script. This was revolutionary. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies had ruled Egypt as foreign monarchs, maintaining Greek as the language of court and administration, keeping themselves separate from their Egyptian subjects. Cleopatra broke with this tradition. She presented herself at Egyptian religious ceremonies. She participated in Egyptian rituals. She adopted the role of pharaoh in its ancient sense. She understood that to rule Egypt effectively, she needed the support not just of the Greek and Macedonian elite of Alexandria, but of the native Egyptian population. She also studied Egyptian history and religion, recognizing that Egypt's past was a source of legitimacy and fear. The Ptolemies had always claimed to be pharaohs, but Cleopatra worked to embody this role more completely than her predecessors. She associated herself with the goddess Isis, who was particularly important in Egyptian religion. Isis was the ideal wife and mother, the goddess of magic and wisdom, the divine feminine principle. By identifying herself with Isis, Cleopatra connected herself to thousands of years of Egyptian religious tradition and presented herself as the earthly manifestation of divine power. This was not mere play acting or propaganda. Cleopatra genuinely seems to have understood and appreciated Egyptian culture. She spent time traveling through Egypt, visiting the great temples at Thebes and elsewhere, showing herself to her subjects. She understood that Egypt was more than just Alexandria, that the ancient civilization along the Nile had its own dignity and worth that deserved respect. At the same time, she was thoroughly Hellenistic in her outlook. She loved Greek poetry and philosophy. She patronized Greek scholars. She spoke and wrote in elegant Greek. She understood Greek political theory and was familiar with the histories of the Greek city-states and the conquests of Alexander. She was, in many ways, the ideal product of Hellenistic education, sophisticated, multilingual, intellectually curious, and culturally aware. This combination of Greek and Egyptian, this ability to move between cultures and speak to different audiences in their own languages and cultural frameworks, would prove to be one of Cleopatra's greatest strengths. She could present herself as a Greek monarch to Romans and Greeks, as a pharaoh to Egyptians, as a universal monarch to everyone. She understood that power in the ancient world required not just military force and economic resources, but also cultural legitimacy and symbolic authority. The path to power. In 51 BCE, when Cleopatra was 18 years old, her father Ptolemy III died. According to his will, Cleopatra was to rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy III, who was only about 10 years old. This arrangement was not unusual in the Ptolemaic dynasty. Joint rule by siblings, usually coupled with sibling marriage, was a standard practice designed to keep power within the family and prevent civil war over succession. But from the beginning, this joint rule was troubled. Cleopatra was the senior partner by virtue of age and ability, but her brother's advisors, particularly the eunuch Pothinus, who served as regent, and the general Achillas, who commanded the army, were hostile to her. They represented the traditional Alexandrian court faction, which was comfortable with the status quo of submission to Rome and suspicious of Cleopatra's attempts to strengthen Egypt's position. For the first 3 years of their joint reign, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII's names appeared together on official documents, and the date was given by both their regnal years. But tensions mounted. Cleopatra attempted to assert her authority, to rule as the senior partner. She had coins struck bearing only her image. She had documents issued in her name alone. This was bold, perhaps too bold for the conservative forces at court. In 48 BCE, matters came to a head. The exact circumstances are murky, lost in the fog of ancient history and later propaganda, but it appears that Ptolemy XIII's advisors managed to force Cleopatra from Alexandria. She fled to Syria, where she began gathering support and raising an army. She was determined to return and reclaim her throne. Meanwhile, the Roman world was tearing itself apart. For years, the Roman Republic had been sliding toward civil war. The political system that had governed Rome for centuries was breaking down under the strain of empire. The Senate, once the supreme governing body, was increasingly paralyzed by factionalism. Powerful generals commanded personal armies and competed for supremacy. The two most powerful men in Rome were Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known to history as Pompey the Great, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Pompey was older, more established, associated with the Optimates or conservative faction in Roman politics. Caesar was brilliant, ambitious, and had built a loyal army during his conquest of Gaul. The third member of their political alliance, Marcus Licinius Crassus, had died in a disastrous campaign against Parthia in 53 BCE, removing the stabilizing influence that had kept Pompey and Caesar from open conflict. In 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his army, an act of war against the Roman state. Civil war erupted. Pompey and his allies fled Italy, eventually establishing themselves in Greece with a large army. Caesar pursued them. On August 9, 48 BCE, at Pharsalus in Thessaly, Caesar won a decisive victory. Pompey's army was destroyed. Pompey himself fled. And where did Pompey flee? To Egypt. This decision would prove fatal, and it would change Cleopatra's life forever. Caesar in Egypt. Pompey arrived off the coast of Egypt in late September 48 BCE. He had been a patron and ally of Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra's father, and he reasonably expected that Ptolemy XIII's government would give him refuge and support. He was wrong. The young king's advisors, Pothinus and Achillas, faced a dilemma. If they supported Pompey and Caesar won the civil war, they would face Rome's wrath. If they rejected Pompey and he somehow managed to recover and defeat Caesar, they would lose a potential patron. They chose a third option, one that reveals much about the brutal nature of Ptolemaic court politics. They invited Pompey to come ashore. As his boat reached the beach near Pelusium, Pompey was stabbed to death by men he had considered friends, allies from his earlier campaigns in the east. His head was cut off as a gift for Caesar. His body was left on the beach. A few days later, Caesar arrived in Alexandria with a small force. He had only about 4,000 men with him, having outpaced his main army in his pursuit of Pompey. When Pothinus presented him with Pompey's head, Caesar reportedly wept. Whether these were genuine tears for a former friend and son-in-law, Pompey had been married to Caesar's daughter Julia, who had died in childbirth years before, or the calculated performance of a skilled politician, we cannot know. But Caesar made it clear that he found the murder distasteful, however convenient it might be for him politically. Caesar now found himself in an awkward position. He had chased Pompey to Egypt, but Pompey was dead. Caesar needed money, civil war was expensive, and Egypt was wealthy. He also saw an opportunity to involve himself in Egyptian affairs. Ptolemy the Thene had owed money to Rome. Money that Caesar could claim was now owed to him personally. Furthermore, as consul and master of the Roman state, Caesar could position himself as arbiter of the dispute between Cleopatra and Ptolemy the. He summoned both siblings to Alexandria to appear before him and settle their quarrel. This was an extraordinary claim to authority over Egyptian affairs, but Egypt was in no position to refuse. Ptolemy the Thebes came to Alexandria with his army and his advisors. Cleopatra, who was still in Syria with her forces, faced a problem. If she tried to march to Alexandria with her army, she would likely be intercepted by Ptolemy's forces and killed. She needed a way to get to Caesar directly, to present her case without interference from her brother's advisors. What happened next has become one of the most famous stories in history, though the details have been embroidered and romanticized over the centuries. According to Plutarch, writing more than a century later, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into the palace in Alexandria inside a rolled-up carpet or sleeping bag. She was carried through the streets and into Caesar's presence, then dramatically emerged from her covering. The image is irresistible. The young queen, only 21 years old, making a theatrical entrance designed to impress the most sophisticated man in the world. But we should be careful about taking this story at face value. Plutarch was writing long after the events, and he loved a good story. The carpet tale might be true, or it might be an embellishment of a more mundane reality. What we can be confident about is that Cleopatra did manage to get to Caesar, that she did present her case to him directly, and that she made an extraordinary impression on him. Caesar was 52 years old, a veteran of decades of Roman politics, a man who had seen everything and everyone. He was not easily impressed. But Cleopatra impressed him. What impressed him was not primarily her physical beauty. By all accounts, Cleopatra was attractive, but not extraordinarily beautiful in a conventional sense. Plutarch tells us that her beauty was not in itself incomparable, but that it was her conversation, her intelligence, and her presence that were irresistible. She could speak to Caesar in Greek without an interpreter, which was a novelty for a Roman general, used to dealing through translators. She could discuss philosophy and politics, literature and history. She was witty and charming, but also serious and intelligent. And she had something else. She had a proposition. She offered Caesar not just her personal company, though that was surely part of the attraction, but also an alliance with Egypt. If Caesar supported her claim to the throne, she would use Egypt's wealth to support him. She would be a loyal ally of Rome, or rather, a loyal ally of Caesar specifically. She understood that Rome's civil wars presented opportunities as well as dangers, that the winner of these wars would need friends and resources, and that Egypt could be useful to Caesar. Caesar made his decision. He declared that according to Ptolemy the Thene's will, Cleopatra and Ptolemy the Theth should rule jointly as husband and wife. The marriage part was, of course, normal Ptolemaic practice. But it was clear to everyone that Caesar favored Cleopatra. He moved into the royal palace. He and Cleopatra became lovers. This relationship would scandalize Rome and fascinate historians for centuries to come. Caesar was married to Calpurnia in Rome, though in truth, by the standards of Roman aristocrats of his time, his various affairs were unremarkable. What was remarkable was the political dimension of this relationship, the way personal and political considerations intertwined. Ptolemy Thene's advisors recognized the threat. If Cleopatra had Caesar's support, they would lose power, and probably their lives. They stirred up the Alexandrian mob against the Romans, depicting Caesar as a foreign invader who was interfering in Egyptian affairs and stealing Egyptian gold. Fighting broke out in Alexandria. What became known as the Alexandrian War began. This was a difficult period for Caesar. He was trapped in the palace complex with only a few thousand troops, while Ptolemy Thene's army, commanded by Achillas, besieged him. The Alexandrian mob was hostile. The situation was dangerous. During the fighting, part of the great library of Alexandria caught fire and burned, a tragedy for learning, though the extent of the damage has been debated by historians. Caesar managed to send for reinforcements. He held out through the winter of 48 to 47 BCE. Cleopatra was with him throughout this time. They were under siege together, their lives in danger together. This shared danger doubtless strengthened their bond. In March 47 BCE, Caesar's reinforcements arrived. With his combined forces, Caesar defeated Ptolemy Thene's army in a battle along the Nile. The young king drowned in the Nile while trying to escape, weighed down by his golden armor. Caesar was now master of Egypt. He could have simply annexed the country, making it a Roman province. Instead, he chose to maintain the fiction of Egyptian independence. Cleopatra was restored to the throne, now to rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only about 12 years old. There would be no question of who was really in charge. Cleopatra was the true ruler of Egypt, and she ruled with Caesar's support. The birth of Caesarion. In the summer of 47 BCE, Caesar and Cleopatra took a journey together up the Nile. This was not simply a pleasure cruise, though it was certainly pleasurable. It was a display of power and legitimacy. Caesar, the master of Rome, sailed through Egypt with the pharaoh. They traveled in magnificent river barges, accompanied by a fleet of ships carrying troops and courtiers. They visited the great temples. They were received by the priests. They made offerings to the gods. For Caesar, this was a chance to see the ancient wonders of Egypt, the pyramids and temples, the monuments of a civilization that had endured for thousands of years. For Cleopatra, it was a chance to show herself to her Egyptian subjects with the most powerful man in the world at her side, to demonstrate that she had secured Egypt's position through her alliance with Caesar. It was during this period that Cleopatra became pregnant with Caesar's child. In June 47 BCE, she gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, but everyone called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. The birth of this child had profound political implications. For Cleopatra, it bound her more closely to Caesar. Caesarion was the grandson of two pharaohs, through his mother, and the son of the most powerful man in Rome. He represented a potential union of East and West, of the ancient Egyptian kingdom and the rising Roman power. For Caesar, the existence of a son, even one born outside of marriage, was significant. Caesar's marriage to Calpurnia had produced no children. His only legitimate child had been Julia, who had died years before. Caesarion represented a potential heir, though Caesar never publicly acknowledged him as such. But Caesar could not stay in Egypt. He had a civil war to finish. In the summer of 47 BCE, he left Egypt and headed east to deal with Pharnaces, the king of Pontus, who had taken advantage of the Roman civil war to invade Roman territories. Caesar defeated him with such speed that he sent back his famous dispatch, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Caesar then returned to Rome, where he celebrated 4 triumphs for his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe, who had sided with Ptolemy III during the Alexandrian War, was displayed in Caesar's triumph, walking in chains through the streets of Rome. This display of a royal captive would have been humiliating for Egypt, a reminder of Rome's power over the Ptolemaic house. Cleopatra in Rome. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra travelled to Rome with her young son and her brother-husband, Ptolemy Philotas. She was Caesar's guest, or perhaps his hostage, depending on one's perspective. She stayed in Caesar's villa across the Tiber River, outside the formal boundaries of the city. This visit was controversial. Roman society was deeply conservative in many ways, and the presence of a foreign queen, particularly one who was so closely associated with Caesar, was disturbing to traditional Romans. Cleopatra represented everything that many Romans feared and despised about the East: luxury, absolutism, feminine power, exotic religious practices. Caesar commissioned a golden statue of Cleopatra dressed as Venus Genetrix, the mother goddess from whom Caesar's family, the Julii, claimed descent. He placed this statue in the temple of Venus Genetrix that he had built in the Forum Julium. This was an extraordinary honor, but it also fed suspicions about Caesar's intentions. Was he planning to make himself king? Was he planning to move the capital of the Roman world to Alexandria? Was he under the spell of this foreign queen? These suspicions were not entirely unfounded. Caesar was accumulating unprecedented powers. He had been named dictator, initially for limited periods, but eventually for life. He was reforming the Roman calendar, issuing coins with his image, receiving divine honors. To traditional Republicans, these were the marks of monarchy, and monarchy was anathema to Romans, who had expelled their last king nearly 500 years before. During her time in Rome, Cleopatra would have mixed with Roman high society, or at least those Romans who were willing to associate with her. She would have met Caesar's allies and associates, including men like Mark Antony, who was serving as Caesar's deputy. She would have experienced Roman culture and Roman politics firsthand, learning how the Roman system worked, understanding the personalities and factions that shaped Roman decision-making. But if Cleopatra hoped that her presence in Rome would lead to a formal alliance between Egypt and Rome, perhaps even recognition of Caesarion as Caesar's heir, she was disappointed. Caesar never publicly acknowledged Caesarion as his son. He never moved to formalize his relationship with Cleopatra. Whatever their personal relationship, whatever his private feelings, Caesar remained politically cautious about his connection to the Egyptian queen. The Ides of March. On March 15th, 44 BCE, everything changed. Caesar was assassinated. He was stabbed to death in a meeting of the Senate at the theatre of Pompey by a group of senators who called themselves the Liberators. They claimed they were acting to save the Republic from tyranny, to prevent Caesar from making himself king. The conspiracy was led by men like Marcus Junius Brutus, whom Caesar had trusted and favoured, and Gaius Cassius Longinus. They struck during a Senate meeting, surrounding Caesar and stabbing him repeatedly. He died at the foot of Pompey's statue, reportedly saying nothing more than "Kesi teknon," Kaisu teknon. You too, child? To Brutus. For Cleopatra, this was a catastrophe. Her patron, her lover, the father of her child, the man who guaranteed her position and Egypt's security, was dead. And she was in Rome when it happened. Or perhaps she had just left. The sources are unclear about the exact timing. What happened next revealed Caesar's true feelings, or at least his political calculations. His will was read publicly. He had left his estate to his 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted son, Gaius Octavius, later known as Octavian and eventually as Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Caesarion was not mentioned. This must have been a bitter blow to Cleopatra. Cleopatra quickly left Rome and returned to Egypt. The political situation was chaotic and dangerous. Caesar's assassins controlled Rome initially, but Caesar's supporters, particularly Mark Antony, who was consul, rallied. Civil war loomed again. Egypt needed to stay out of this conflict if possible, to wait and see who would emerge victorious before committing to any side. Shortly after returning to Egypt, Cleopatra's brother-husband Ptolemy XIV died. The ancient sources suggest he was poisoned, and Cleopatra is the obvious suspect. With Ptolemy XIV dead, she elevated her son Caesarion to co-ruler. He was only about 3 years old, but in the Ptolemaic tradition, he was now Ptolemy XV Caesar, ruling jointly with his mother. In practice, of course, Cleopatra ruled alone. The rise of the triumvirs. In the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, the Roman world descended into another civil war. On one side were Caesar's assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius. On the other side were Caesar's supporters, initially led by Mark Antony, but soon joined by Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. Mark Antony and Octavian initially distrusted each other intensely. Antony was older, experienced, a distinguished general who had been Caesar's right-hand man. Octavian was only 19, with no military experience, no political track record, nothing but the magic of Caesar's name. But that name proved to be extraordinarily powerful. Caesar's veterans rallied to the young man who bore Caesar's name and carried Caesar's legacy. Antony and Octavian realized they needed each other to defeat Caesar's assassins. They joined forces, along with Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, another of Caesar's former generals. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a 3-man dictatorship with constitutional authority. It was a ruthless arrangement. The triumvirs drew up proscription lists, lists of political enemies to be executed, their property confiscated. Hundreds of senators and equestrians died in the purge. Among them was Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator and statesman who had spoken out against Antony. He was hunted down and killed, his head and hands cut off and displayed on the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum. In 42 BCE, the triumvirs crossed to Greece to face Brutus and Cassius. At Philippi in Macedonia, they won 2 battles that destroyed the Republican cause. Brutus and Cassius both committed suicide. Caesar's death was avenged. Now the triumvirs divided the Roman world among themselves. Octavian took the west, primarily Italy, Gaul, and Spain. Lepidus, the junior partner, received Africa. Antony took the east, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and the client states in those regions. This meant that Antony was now responsible for the east, which included overseeing Rome's relationship with Egypt. Enter Mark. Antony Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, was in many ways the opposite of Octavian. Where Octavian was cold, calculating, and cautious, Antony was warm, impulsive, and charismatic. He was a soldier's general, beloved by his troops. He was physically impressive, known for his strength and energy. He enjoyed life's pleasures, wine, banquets, theatre, women. He came from a noble family but was not particularly intellectual or refined by Roman aristocratic standards. Antony had known Cleopatra for years. He had been a young cavalry officer in Egypt back in 55 BCE, when he participated in the expedition that restored her father to the throne. He had been Caesar's deputy during the Civil War and had certainly encountered Cleopatra during her time in Rome. But their relationship had been distant, formal. Now, in 41 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in Cilicia, modern-day Turkey. He wanted Egypt's support, military support and financial support, for a planned campaign against Parthia. He also wanted to question her about her loyalties during the Civil War. Had she supported Brutus and Cassius? There were rumors that she had sent aid to Caesar's assassins, though she claimed that her governor in Cyprus had acted without her authorization. Cleopatra decided to make an impression. According to Plutarch's famous account, she came to Tarsus in magnificent style. She sailed up the Cydnus River in a barge with gilded stern, purple sails, and silver oars. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Venus, the goddess of love. Beautiful boys dressed as Cupids fanned her. Young women dressed as Nereids and Graces worked the oars or served at the steering. The whole scene was calculated to overwhelm the senses. Crowds lined the riverbanks to watch. When Antony sent word inviting Cleopatra to dinner, she responded that he should dine with her instead. He accepted. The banquet she provided was sumptuous beyond anything Antony had experienced. The food, the wine, the entertainment, the conversation, everything was designed to impress, to seduce, to demonstrate that Egypt still had power and wealth worth courting. Antony was impressed, more than impressed. He was enchanted. Whatever Cleopatra's physical attractions, and they were apparently considerable, her true power lay in her intelligence and charm. She could match Antony in conversation, in wit, in the ability to enjoy life. Where Caesar had been attracted to her intelligence and political acumen, Antony seems to have been attracted to her as a companion in pleasure. But we should not make the mistake of thinking this was merely a romantic affair, an infatuation without political calculation. Both Antony and Cleopatra were shrewd politicians who understood that their personal relationship served political purposes. For Antony, an alliance with Egypt meant access to Egyptian wealth and grain, essential for his planned campaigns in the East. For Cleopatra, an alliance with Antony meant protection for Egypt and the possibility of expanding Egyptian territory. Antony agreed to return with Cleopatra to Alexandria for the winter of 41 to 40 BCE. This was presented as a visit, but it was more than that. Antony was effectively abandoning his duties in the East to live in Alexandria with Cleopatra. They lived in luxury. They formed a society called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to pleasure and extravagance. They held banquets, they went on expeditions, they played elaborate games. Plutarch tells stories of their life together that might be exaggerated, but give a flavor of their relationship. He describes how Cleopatra would go on fishing expeditions with Antony, and how once, when Antony was catching nothing, he had divers secretly attach fish to his line, so he would appear successful. Cleopatra discovered the trick, and the next day had one of her servants attach a salted fish from the Black Sea to Antony's hook, making everyone laugh at the joke. These stories show a relationship of equals, of two people who enjoyed each other's company, who could joke and play together. This was different from Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar, which seems to have been more serious, more focused on politics and power. With Antony, there seems to have been genuine affection alongside political calculation. During this time, Cleopatra became pregnant with twins. She would give birth in 40 BCE to a boy and a girl, whom she named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, Alexander Sun and Cleopatra Moon. The choice of names was significant, linking her children to both Greek tradition, Alexander the Eu, Great, and Egyptian cosmology, sun and moon. The world pulls them apart. But Antony could not stay in Alexandria indefinitely. Duty called him back. In 40 BCE, tensions between Antony and Octavian nearly erupted into open war. Antony's wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius had raised rebellion against Octavian in Italy. The rebellion failed, and Fulvia fled to Athens, where she died. Meanwhile, the Parthians invaded Roman territories in Syria and Asia Minor, taking advantage of Roman internal conflicts. Antony had to deal with these crises. He met with Octavian at Brundisium in Italy. The two triumvirs, who had been on the verge of war, instead made peace. To seal their alliance, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia. This was a political marriage, of course, but by all accounts, Octavia was a virtuous and capable woman, well regarded in Rome. For Cleopatra, this marriage must have been troubling, but perhaps not unexpected. Roman aristocrats often had political marriages, alongside other relationships. The marriage to Octavia was about Roman politics, about preserving the alliance between Antony and Octavian. It didn't necessarily mean the end of Antony's relationship with Cleopatra. And indeed, for the next 3 years, Antony focused on Roman affairs. He campaigned against the Parthians, drove them out of Roman territory, and attempted to invade Parthia itself. He lived in Athens with Octavia, who bore him 2 daughters. He fulfilled his duties as a triumvir. Cleopatra raised their children in Alexandria and ruled Egypt. But in 37 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to Antioch. Their relationship resumed. This time, it would last until death. The donations of Alexandria. Between 37 BCE and 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra's relationship evolved from a personal affair into a political partnership that challenged the very structure of Roman power in the Mediterranean. This period saw them attempting to create a kind of Hellenistic Roman hybrid empire in the East, with Alexandria as its capital. Antony formally acknowledged his children with Cleopatra, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and a younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, born around 36 BCE. He also apparently began to acknowledge Caesarion as Caesar's son, calling him Ptolemy Caesar, and recognizing him as the legitimate heir to Caesar's legacy. This was a direct challenge to Octavian, who had staked everything on being Caesar's only legitimate heir. Antony gave Cleopatra substantial territories. He returned parts of the old Ptolemaic Empire that Rome had taken over the years, coastal Phoenicia, parts of Syria, parts of Cilicia, the island of Cyprus, parts of Crete and Cyrenaica. For Cleopatra, this was a restoration of Egyptian power, a reversal of centuries of Ptolemaic decline. For Antony, it was a practical measure. These territories would be more efficiently administered under Egyptian control, and the revenues would support his military campaigns. But the most dramatic moment came in 34 BCE, after Antony's moderately successful campaign in Armenia. He celebrated a triumph, not in Rome as tradition required, but in Alexandria. This was symbolically significant, a statement that Alexandria, not Rome, was the true capital of the East. During this celebration, Antony held what became known as the Donations of Alexandria. He gathered the people of Alexandria in the gymnasium. On golden thrones sat Cleopatra, dressed as Isis, and Caesarion, her eldest son. On lower thrones sat the 3 children Cleopatra had with Antony. Antony then made his proclamations. Cleopatra was declared Queen of Kings, and Caesarion King of Kings. Caesarion was declared the true son of Caesar and Julius Caesar's legitimate heir. Antony's children with Cleopatra were given royal titles and territories. Alexander Helios was named King of Armenia, Media, and Parthia, territories not yet conquered. Cleopatra Selene was named Queen of Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus was named King of Syria and Cilicia. These donations were both real and fantastical. Some of the territories were genuinely under Antony's control and could be administered by Cleopatra on behalf of their children. Others were aspirational. Parthia, for instance, had never been conquered by Rome. But the symbolism was clear. Antony was creating a new kind of empire in the East, one where his children with Cleopatra would rule vast territories, where Cleopatra herself would be supreme, and where Caesarion would be recognized as Caesar's true heir. For Octavian in Rome, this was intolerable. Every element of the donations challenged his position. The recognition of Caesarion as Caesar's son challenged Octavian's claim to be Caesar's true heir. The gift of Roman territories to a foreign queen and her children seemed to be giving away Roman conquests. The triumph celebrated in Alexandria rather than Rome suggested that Antony no longer considered himself primarily a Roman but had gone native, become Egyptianized, fallen under the spell of this foreign queen. The Propaganda War. What followed was one of history's great propaganda wars. Octavian and Antony, once allies, now moved toward inevitable conflict. And much of this conflict was fought not on battlefields, but in the realm of public opinion, particularly Roman public opinion. Octavian portrayed Antony as having abandoned Rome, having been seduced and corrupted by Cleopatra. In Octavian's propaganda, Cleopatra was an existential threat to Rome, a foreign queen, an oriental despot, a dangerous woman who wielded unnatural power over men. She was accused of planning to make herself Empress of Rome, of wanting to rule from Alexandria, of intending to destroy Roman values and Roman liberty. The sexual dimension of the propaganda was particularly virulent. Cleopatra was portrayed as lustful, decadent, using sexual allure to control men and bend them to her will. She had seduced Caesar. Now she had seduced Antony. She represented everything Romans claimed to despise about Eastern kingdoms: luxury, excess, effeminacy, as Romans saw it, the unnatural power of women. This propaganda drew on and reinforced deep-seated Roman prejudices. Romans prided themselves on their virtue, their discipline, their manliness. They defined themselves against what they saw as Eastern softness and decadence. A Roman man was supposed to be in control of himself, not controlled by passions or by women. Antony, in Octavian's propaganda, had betrayed these Roman values. Octavian's propaganda machine was formidable. Poets and historians who wrote during the Augustan age, after Octavian took the name Augustus and became Rome's first emperor, echoed these themes. Virgil's Aeneid, Rome's great national epic, includes a description of the Battle of Actium, in which Cleopatra is depicted as a monstrous Eastern queen threatening Rome. Horace's poetry includes attacks on Cleopatra as a fatale monstrum, a fatal monster. Propertius's poetry similarly presents her as a threatening foreign queen. Much of what we think we know about Cleopatra comes from this hostile propaganda. Ancient historians like Plutarch, Dio Cassius, and Josephus wrote centuries after these events, and their sources were often coloured by Augustan propaganda. They describe Cleopatra's beauty and charm, but also her ambition and ruthlessness. They credit her with intelligence, but suggest it was intelligence in service of wicked goals. Modern historians have worked to separate fact from propaganda, to reconstruct a more balanced picture of who Cleopatra really was. But it's difficult. The propaganda was so effective, so pervasive, that it has shaped Cleopatra's image for 2,000 years. What we can say is that Cleopatra was a capable ruler who worked to preserve Egypt's independence and expand its power. She was trying to navigate the dangerous waters of Roman civil war, to position Egypt advantageously regardless of which Roman faction won. Her relationship with Antony was both personal and political, a genuine partnership between two powerful people who saw advantages in alliance. From Cleopatra's perspective, the donations of Alexandria made sense. They restored territories that had historically been part of the Ptolemaic Empire. They secured her children's futures as rulers of a renewed Hellenistic empire. They established Egypt as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean, with Rome's blessing, or at least Antony's blessing. She may not have fully understood how this would play in Rome, how it would be perceived by Roman public opinion, or she may have understood but calculated that if Antony defeated Octavian, Roman public opinion wouldn't matter. The victor in the coming civil war would decide what Rome thought about Egypt and its queen. The road to Actium. By 32 BCE, the final break between Antony and Octavian was approaching. Both sides prepared for war, gathering armies and fleets, securing allies, positioning forces. Octavian needed a pretext for war. He couldn't simply declare war on Antony, who was still legally a triumvir, still a Roman magistrate. To attack Antony directly would be to start a civil war, and Romans were weary of civil war. So Octavian did something clever. He declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. Egypt, he claimed, was planning to invade Rome. Cleopatra was the threat, the foreign queen who sought to destroy Roman liberty. Antony was not a traitor. He was a victim, a man who had been seduced and manipulated by this dangerous woman. If he chose to fight alongside Cleopatra against Rome, that was his tragic mistake. But the war itself was against Egypt, against the foreign threat. This framing was important. It allowed Romans who might have been reluctant to fight in yet another civil war to see themselves as defending Rome against a foreign enemy. It allowed Octavian to position himself as a patriotic defender of Rome rather than as one faction leader fighting another. In 32 BCE, Antony formally divorced Octavia, Octavian's sister. This was the final personal break between the two men, an unforgivable insult to Octavian. It also suggested that Antony was now fully committed to Cleopatra and to the Eastern Partnership they had built. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces in Greece. Their army was substantial, perhaps 75,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry. Their fleet numbered some 500 ships, including many Egyptian vessels. They had the resources of the East behind them, Egyptian wealth, grain from Egypt's fertile delta, the manpower of the eastern provinces and client kingdoms. But there were problems. Antony's Roman supporters were uneasy about fighting alongside an Egyptian queen against fellow Romans. There were tensions in the command structure. Some of Antony's officers openly objected to Cleopatra's presence, arguing that she should return to Egypt and let Antony fight as a Roman general leading Roman legions. But Antony refused to send her away. She had financed the war with Egyptian gold. She had a right to be present. She was his partner. Octavian's forces were smaller but more unified. His naval commander, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, was one of the finest admirals of the ancient world. His legions were well-trained and loyal, and crucially, Octavian had Italy and Rome behind him. He could present himself as defending the homeland, fighting for Rome against foreign aggression. The two forces maneuvered through the summer of 31 BCE. Octavian and Agrippa managed to cut Antony's supply lines. Antony's army, camped on the western coast of Greece near Actium, began to suffer from disease and desertion. Supplies were running low. Antony faced a choice. He could try to break out by land, marching his army east and forcing a land battle, or he could try to break out by sea, using his fleet to escape Agrippa's blockade. He chose the sea. On September 2nd, 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra's fleet engaged Octavian's fleet in the Battle of Actium. The Battle of Actium. The Battle of Actium was one of the decisive naval battles in history, though perhaps not in the way usually imagined. Later, Roman propaganda would portray it as a great clash between East and West, between Roman virtue and Oriental decadence, between Octavian's disciplined forces and the corrupted, feminized forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The reality was more complicated. Antony's plan seems to have been not to win a decisive naval victory, but to break through Agrippa's blockade and escape. Many of his ships were undermanned and his crews were sick. He couldn't hope to defeat Agrippa's fleet in a straight fight. Instead, he would try to break through with his strongest ships and escape to Egypt, where he could rebuild his forces. Cleopatra's squadron, some 60 Egyptian ships, were kept in reserve, carrying the war chest, the treasure that would be needed to continue the fight. The plan was apparently for Antony's strongest ships to engage Agrippa's fleet, create confusion, and open a path through which Cleopatra's squadron could escape. Antony would then follow with his remaining ships. The battle began in the morning. Antony's ships engaged Agrippa's fleet. The fighting was fierce, but inconclusive. Then, in the afternoon, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly raised sail and broke away, heading south toward Egypt. This was the signal. But Antony's fleet was scattered, engaged with the enemy. Only a few dozen ships managed to break free and follow Cleopatra. Antony transferred to a smaller, faster ship and raced after the Egyptian squadron, leaving his fleet behind. From Octavian's perspective, this was a stunning victory. Antony had abandoned his fleet in the middle of battle, fleeing with his Egyptian queen. The remaining ships fought on for a while, but eventually they surrendered or were captured. Antony's army, still camped on shore and waiting for orders, learned that their commander had fled. After some days of confusion, they surrendered to Octavian. The propaganda wrote itself. Antony had abandoned his men, abandoned his duty, because he couldn't bear to be separated from Cleopatra. The foreign queen had unmanned him, turned him into something less than a Roman. He had chosen love over honor, passion over duty. But what actually happened at Actium? Was this a planned retreat that went wrong, or was it a panic-stricken flight? Did Cleopatra flee unexpectedly, forcing Antony to follow her, or was her departure part of the plan? Did Antony intend to abandon his fleet and army, or did circumstances force his hand? We will never know for certain. The ancient sources are coloured by Augustan propaganda. Modern historians debate the details. What we can say is that after Actium, Antony and Cleopatra's position was severely weakened, but not yet hopeless. They still had Egypt, still had resources, still had the possibility of rebuilding. But the psychological blow was severe. Antony had lost face, lost credibility, and Octavian was coming. The last months, Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria in defeat. The journey back must have been bitter. They had lost their fleet, their army, their momentum. Many of Antony's supporters and allies abandoned him, making their peace with Octavian. The eastern kingdoms and cities that had supported them now hurried to declare their loyalty to the winner. In Alexandria, Antony fell into depression. According to Plutarch, he built a small dwelling on a breakwater in the harbour and lived there alone for a time, calling himself Timon, after the legendary misanthrope. He felt betrayed, abandoned by fortune, by his followers, perhaps even questioning his own decisions. But there was no time for despair. Octavian was preparing to invade. Antony and Cleopatra tried to rebuild their forces. They executed some of those they suspected of disloyalty. They sent envoys to Octavian trying to negotiate. Cleopatra reportedly sent gifts and her royal insignia, offering to abdicate in favour of her children if they could be spared. Antony asked to be allowed to retire to Athens as a private citizen. Octavian's response was cold. He sent word to Cleopatra that he might be merciful if she killed Antony or expelled him from Egypt. To Antony, he offered nothing. The message was clear. There would be no mercy for Antony, and Cleopatra's only hope was to betray him. She refused. Whatever calculation had brought them together Whatever political considerations had shaped their relationship, there seems to have been genuine loyalty between them at the end. Cleopatra did not abandon Antony. They would face their fate together. They made what preparations they could. Cleopatra had a tomb built near the Temple of Isis, a mausoleum where she could be buried with appropriate honors. She moved her treasure there: gold, silver, jewels, precious, woods, pearls, ostensibly to keep it safe, but perhaps also as a final bargaining chip. If Octavian wanted Egypt's wealth, he would need to deal with her. They created a new society, the successors to the inimitable livers. They called themselves the partners in death, or those who will die together. They held banquets and feasts, perhaps trying to maintain morale, perhaps simply refusing to let their last days be consumed by fear and despair. In the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian invaded Egypt. He approached from the east, his army advancing through Syria and Palestine. Antony marched out with what forces he had left and won a small cavalry skirmish. It was his last victory. But Octavian was too strong. His forces besieged Alexandria by land and sea. Antony's remaining troops began to desert. His cavalry went over to Octavian. His fleet, when it sailed out to engage Octavian's ships, instead surrendered without fighting. Antony understood that it was over. On August 1st, 33 BCE, he stabbed himself with his sword, falling on it in the traditional Roman manner of suicide. But he botched it. The wound was mortal, but not immediately fatal. He lay bleeding, asking his servants to finish the job, but they fled. Then word came that Cleopatra was still alive, that she had barricaded herself in her tomb. Antony's servants carried him there. Cleopatra and her two handmaidens hauled the dying Antony up through a window into the tomb. They couldn't open the doors for fear Octavian's soldiers would force their way in. Antony died in Cleopatra's arms, urging her to make her peace with Octavian, if she could. The death of Cleopatra. After Antony's death, Cleopatra was in an impossible position. She was barricaded in her tomb with Antony's body, with her treasure, and with no good options. If she surrendered, she would be taken to Rome and paraded through the streets in Octavian's triumph, displayed to the jeering crowds as a captive queen, just as her sister Arsinoe had been displayed in Caesar's triumph decades before. It would be the ultimate humiliation for a woman who had been Queen of Egypt, who had been the consort of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She had one asset left: Egypt's treasure. Octavian needed it to pay his troops, to fund his government. If she destroyed the treasure, and she had made preparations to burn it, then Octavian would have won Egypt, but gained nothing. This gave her minimal leverage. Octavian's officers broke into the tomb and captured Cleopatra before she could harm herself. Octavian himself then came to speak with her. What they said to each other, we don't know for certain. The ancient sources provide various accounts, but they're all written by authors sympathetic to Octavian, and we should be skeptical. What seems clear is that Octavian tried to reassure Cleopatra, to convince her that she would be treated honorably. Perhaps he even hinted that she might be allowed to remain as a client queen under Roman authority. But Cleopatra was too intelligent to believe such promises. She understood that Octavian needed her for his triumph, that her value to him was as a symbol of conquest, a defeated enemy to be displayed before the Roman people. She also learned through sources in Octavian's camp that he was planning to transport her and her children to Rome within a few days. Time was running out. On August 10th or 12th, 30 BCE, the exact date is uncertain, Cleopatra killed herself. The method has been debated for 2 millennia. The most famous story told by Plutarch and other ancient sources is that she used an aish, an Egyptian cobra, a sacred symbol of Egyptian royalty. According to this account, the snake was smuggled into her tomb in a basket of figs. She either let it bite her or held it to her breast, dying from the venom. Modern scholars have questioned this account. Cobra venom doesn't work that way. It would cause a slow, painful death, not the quick, peaceful end described in the ancient sources. Some have suggested she used a different poison, perhaps one applied to a sharp implement, or perhaps simply a toxic substance she swallowed. Others have even questioned whether she was murdered, though there's no real evidence for this. What matters is that Cleopatra chose to die on her own terms, rather than live as Octavian's captive. She was found dead, dressed in her royal robes, lying on her golden couch. Her two faithful handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, died with her, either from the same poison or from their own choice, to follow their queen in death. Octavian was reportedly furious. He had been denied his prize, the centerpiece of his triumph. He could display statues and paintings of Cleopatra, but not the living woman. Nevertheless, he gave orders that Cleopatra be buried with honors beside Antony. This at least suggests some respect, some acknowledgement that she had been a worthy opponent. The exact location of their tomb has never been found. It was somewhere in Alexandria, but the ancient city is now largely underwater or buried beneath the modern city. The tomb of Cleopatra and Antony remains one of archaeology's great unfound treasures. The fate of her children. Cleopatra's death did not end the story of her family. She had left behind 4 children, each facing an uncertain fate under the new order Octavian was creating. Caesarion, her eldest son, was 17 years old. He was the most dangerous of Cleopatra's children from Octavian's perspective. As long as Caesarion lived, he represented an alternative claimant to Caesar's legacy. Octavian had built his entire position on being Caesar's heir. He couldn't allow another son of Caesar to survive. Cleopatra had tried to save Caesarion. She had sent him away before the end, reportedly to India with a substantial treasure, hoping he might escape Octavian's reach. But Caesarion was betrayed by his tutor, who convinced him to return to Alexandria, claiming that Octavian would allow him to rule Egypt. When Caesarion returned, he was executed. Octavian reportedly quoted Homer, "Too many Caesars is not a good thing." The 3 children Cleopatra had with Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared. They were taken to Rome and placed in the household of Octavia, Antony's Roman widow, and Octavian's sister. It's a strange twist of fate. The children of Antony and Cleopatra were raised by Antony's Roman wife, alongside Octavia's children by Antony. We don't know what happened to the boys, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus. They disappear from the historical record, presumably dying young, though the circumstances are unknown. But Cleopatra Selene survived. When she was old enough, Octavian, by then called Augustus, married her to Juba II, a client king who ruled Mauritania, roughly modern Algeria and Morocco. Cleopatra Selene became queen of Mauritania. She and Juba had at least one son, Ptolemy, who would eventually rule Mauritania after them. So a fragment of the Ptolemaic line survived, ruling a kingdom in North Africa under Roman oversight. Cleopatra Selene named her children with Ptolemaic names, maintained Ptolemaic traditions, and according to archaeological evidence, patronized Hellenistic culture in Mauritania. In a small way, she kept her mother's legacy alive, but Egypt itself was finished as an independent kingdom. Octavian made Egypt a special province of Rome, one governed by an equestrian prefect appointed directly by him rather than by a senatorial governor, like other provinces. No senator was even allowed to visit Egypt without the emperor's permission. Egypt became effectively the personal property of the Roman emperor, its wealth used to fund the imperial government. The age of the pharaohs, which had lasted for 3,000 years, was over. Legacy and memory. And yet, Cleopatra did not disappear. Her legend grew, taking on a life of its own, separate from our historical reality. In antiquity, she was remembered in contradictory ways. Roman sources, coloured by Augustan propaganda, portrayed her as the dangerous foreign seductress, the femme fatale who corrupted Roman generals and threatened Roman liberty. She was the warning example of what happened when Romans let themselves be seduced by Eastern luxury and feminine wiles. But there were other traditions too. Egyptian sources were mostly lost or destroyed. But what fragments remain suggest that she was remembered as a legitimate pharaoh, a capable ruler who had tried to preserve Egypt's independence. The Coptic Christian tradition in Egypt preserved some memory of her as a scholar and philosopher, crediting her with various writings. Medieval Arabic sources portrayed her as a learned queen who built great monuments. In the Renaissance and early modern period, Cleopatra became a figure of drama and romance. William Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra portrayed her as a complex figure, neither simply villain nor victim, but a woman of passion and intelligence caught in circumstances beyond her control. The play ends with Cleopatra's magnificent suicide speech. "Give me my robe. Put on my crown. I have immortal longings in me." This Cleopatra, passionate, tragic, noble in her final choice, became the dominant image in Western culture for centuries. She was painted and sculpted by countless artists. She appeared in operas and plays, novels and poems. She was usually portrayed as breathtakingly beautiful, though, as we've noted, the ancient sources suggest her physical beauty was actually not exceptional. What made her attractive was her personality, her intelligence, her charm. In the 19th century, during the height of European imperialism, the image of Cleopatra became entangled with Orientalist fantasies. She was portrayed as the quintessential Eastern queen, exotic and dangerous, representing both the allure and the threat of the East. This Cleopatra was often shown in elaborate costumes surrounded by the trappings of an imagined ancient Egypt that owed more to Victorian fantasy than to historical reality. The 20th century brought new interpretations. The early Hollywood epics, especially the 1934 and 1963 films starring Claudette Colbert and Elizabeth Taylor respectively, presented Cleopatra as a glamorous, sophisticated woman who used her intelligence and charm to play politics at the highest level. Taylor's Cleopatra, in particular, emphasized the Queen's political acumen and her genuine partnership with Antony. More recently, feminist scholars and historians have worked to rescue Cleopatra from the propaganda and fantasy, to reconstruct the historical woman from the limited and biased sources we have. They have emphasized her intelligence, her linguistic abilities, her political skills, her attempts to preserve Egypt's independence in an impossible situation. Modern scholarship has also worked to place Cleopatra in her proper context as a Hellenistic monarch. She was not primarily Egyptian or Roman, but Macedonian Greek by ethnicity and culture. She ruled Egypt, yes, and adopted Egyptian traditions and symbols, but she was fundamentally a product of the Hellenistic world that emerged after Alexander's conquests. She should be compared not primarily to Egyptian pharaohs of earlier ages or to Roman leaders, but to other Hellenistic monarchs, and, by that standard, she was exceptionally capable. Cleopatra, the ruler. Let us step back from the drama and romance and consider Cleopatra as a ruler, for that is fundamentally what she was, a monarch who ruled one of the most important kingdoms in the ancient world for more than 20 years. She inherited a difficult situation. The Ptolemaic kingdom was in decline, squeezed by Rome, weakened by internal strife, its wealth drained by the extravagances and mistakes of previous rulers. She could easily have been just another in the long line of late Ptolemaic monarchs ruling briefly and ineffectively before being overthrown by a sibling or succumbing to Roman pressure. Instead, she stabilized Egypt's position. She secured Roman support first through Caesar and then through Antony. She used Egypt's wealth strategically, funding Roman military campaigns in exchange for political concessions. She recovered territories that had been lost, briefly restoring something like the old Ptolemaic Empire at its height. She was financially astute. Egypt's economy during her reign seems to have been relatively well managed. The Nile floods were good during most of her reign, ensuring agricultural prosperity. She reformed the coinage, maintained the tax system, and kept the elaborate bureaucracy functioning. This was no small achievement. The Ptolemaic state was complex, with layers of Greek and Egyptian officials, military colonists who needed to be paid and kept loyal, priests who needed to be placated, and common people who needed to be fed. She was diplomatically skillful. She navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics, understanding that Egypt's survival depended on choosing the right Roman faction to support. When she allied with Caesar, he was not yet undisputed master of Rome, though he was clearly winning. When she allied with Antony, he was one of the three triumvirs, controlling the eastern half of the Roman world. These were reasonable choices, not obvious mistakes. She was also unlucky. She bet on Antony, and Antony lost. But it's not clear that she had better options. An alliance with Octavian was probably not possible. He was too suspicious of Eastern monarchs, too committed to traditional Roman values, too threatened by her connection to Caesar. Trying to remain neutral in the Roman civil war would have been extremely difficult, and probably would have failed, leaving Egypt vulnerable to whoever won. As a monarch, she seems to have commanded genuine loyalty. Her subjects followed her, and her officials served her faithfully. When she died, her handmaidens died with her. This suggests that she inspired personal loyalty, that she was not simply feared, but respected and perhaps even loved by those close to her. The question of beauty. We cannot leave Cleopatra without addressing the question that has obsessed people for 2,000 years. Was she beautiful? The answer is complicated. The ancient sources are contradictory. Plutarch, our most detailed source, specifically says that her beauty was not in itself incomparable, and that she was not the most beautiful woman in the world. What made her attractive, he says, was her conversation, her intelligence, her presence, the sweetness of her voice. He compares her to a musical instrument with many strings, able to create beautiful music. Other sources emphasize her beauty more, but they were writing under the influence of the Augustan propaganda, which portrayed her as the seductress who corrupted Roman generals. It suited Octavian's narrative to portray Cleopatra as irresistibly beautiful. It helped explain why Antony and Caesar had fallen under her spell. We have a few portraits of Cleopatra that might be contemporary or near contemporary. Some coins, some sculptures. They show a woman with a prominent nose, a strong chin, and intelligent eyes. By modern standards or by the standards of conventional beauty in any age, she was attractive, but not exceptionally so. She looks like a real person, not like an idealized statue. But we should remember that ancient standards of beauty were different from ours. The Greeks and Romans appreciated different qualities than modern Western culture does. Moreover, Cleopatra was a monarch, and monarchs were not judged solely or even primarily on their physical appearance. They were judged on their bearing, their presence, their ability to command. What seems clear is that Cleopatra had extraordinary personal magnetism. She could charm the most sophisticated men in the world, Julius Caesar, who had seen everything and everyone, Mark Antony, who had been around aristocratic Roman women all his life. She could do this despite the significant age difference. She was 30 years younger than Caesar. Despite coming from a foreign culture, despite the challenges of translation and cultural differences, this charm was not purely physical. It came from her intelligence, her education, her linguistic abilities, her wit, her presence, her understanding of people. It came from her ability to make people feel understood and appreciated, to engage them in conversation, to be genuinely interesting and interested. In the end, the question of whether Cleopatra was beautiful misses the point. She was magnetic, charismatic, compelling. She had presence, and that was far more important than conventional beauty. Cleopatra in historical context. To truly understand Cleopatra, we need to place her in the context of her time, to understand the forces that shaped her life and her choices. She lived in a world that was fundamentally changing. The Hellenistic age, which had begun with Alexander the Great's conquests nearly 3 centuries before, was ending. The Hellenistic kingdoms that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid kingdom in Syria and Mesopotamia, the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia, were all failing or had already fallen. Rome was replacing them, creating a new kind of empire different from the personal kingdoms of the Hellenistic age. Rome itself was changing. The Roman Republic, which had lasted for nearly 500 years, was breaking down. The political system was failing, unable to govern the vast empire Rome had acquired. The civil wars that racked Rome during Cleopatra's lifetime were symptoms of this breakdown. A new system was being born, what we call the Roman Empire, ruled by emperors, though the Romans at the time didn't call it that. Cleopatra was caught between these two worlds, the dying Hellenistic age and the emerging Roman Empire. She tried to navigate this transition, to find a place for Egypt in the new order. She understood that Egypt could not stand alone against Rome, but she hoped that Egypt could remain nominally independent, ruling itself while acknowledging Roman supremacy, perhaps even expanding its influence by allying with the right Roman faction. This was not an impossible dream. Other kingdoms managed it, at least for a time. Judea, under the Herodian dynasty, maintained nominal independence as a Roman client state. Various kingdoms in Asia Minor did the same. Egypt was wealthier and more important than these kingdoms, but the principle was the same. Acknowledge Roman power, provide support to Rome, and, in exchange, maintain your throne. But Cleopatra's Egypt was too important, too wealthy, too strategically located. It was also vulnerable, lying at the end of long supply lines, surrounded by desert, dependent on the Nile floods. Once Rome decided to take direct control of Egypt, there was little Cleopatra could do to prevent it. She also faced the problem of gender. We shouldn't overstate this. Hellenistic queens had real power, and Cleopatra was hardly the first woman to rule in the ancient world. Artemisia of Halicarnassus commanded a fleet at the Battle of Salamis. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was a political force in her own right. The Hellenistic kingdoms had a long tradition of powerful queens. But Rome was different. Rome was intensely patriarchal. Women in Rome had limited legal rights, no vote, no direct access to political office. Women were supposed to be modest, obedient, domestic. A Roman aristocrat might respect his mother or his wife, might even fear her influence in private, but no one would openly acknowledge female power as legitimate. So when Cleopatra presented herself as a ruler in her own right, negotiating as an equal with Roman generals, this violated Roman sensibilities. The propaganda against her drew heavily on the theme of unnatural female power. She was described as controlling men, corrupting them, making them effeminate. This was a standard attack in Roman political discourse. Opponents were routinely accused of being controlled by women. But with Cleopatra, it seemed to be literally true, and this made her particularly threatening to Roman prejudices. What she accomplished. Despite her ultimate failure, despite dying in defeat at age 39, Cleopatra accomplished remarkable things. She ruled Egypt for 21 years, a substantial reign in the violent world of ancient politics. She survived palace coups, civil wars, foreign invasions, and political intrigues. She maintained her power through intelligence and political skill in a world dominated by military force. She briefly restored Egypt to something approaching its old power and glory. The territories she recovered, the influence she wielded, the role Egypt played in the Roman civil wars, all of this testified to her success in reviving Egyptian power. She negotiated as an equal with the most powerful men in the world. Julius Caesar and Mark Antony treated her not as a client or a subject, but as a partner. This was extraordinary for a woman from a client kingdom dealing with Roman generals. She bore 4 children who carried the bloodlines of both the Ptolemaic dynasty and powerful Romans. Through Cleopatra Selene, her line continued to rule in Mauritania. Cleopatra ensured that her genetic legacy, at least, survived. She defended Egypt's independence to the bitter end. Even when the situation was hopeless, she continued to resist, to negotiate, to search for options. And when she understood that there was no way to preserve Egypt's independence or even her own dignity, she chose to die on her own terms rather than live as a Roman captive. She became immortal in a way that few historical figures have. Her name has survived for more than 2,000 years. She has inspired countless works of art, literature, music, and film. She has become a symbol of female power, of doomed love, of the clash between East and West, of intelligence and charm, overcoming ordinary beauty. The end of an era. Cleopatra's death marked the end of multiple eras. It marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. It marked the end of Egypt as an independent kingdom, ending 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization. It marked the end of the Hellenistic age, the final extinction of the world, created by Alexander the Great's conquests. The Egypt that Octavian, soon to be called Augustus, took over was integrated into the Roman Empire. Latin gradually replaced Greek as the language of administration. Roman customs and Roman law replaced Ptolemaic traditions. The old gods continued to be worshipped, but they were increasingly Romanized. The temples continued to function, but under Roman oversight. Alexandria remained a great city, perhaps the second city of the Mediterranean after Rome itself. The library and the museum continued, though diminished. Scholars still came to Alexandria to study, though the greatest days of Hellenistic learning were past. The city gradually became more Roman, less distinctively Egyptian or Greek. The Nile Valley itself changed less dramatically. The peasant farmers who worked the fields, who depended on the annual flood, who made up the vast majority of Egypt's population, for them, life continued much as it had. They paid their taxes to Roman officials instead of Ptolemaic officials, but otherwise, their lives were not dramatically different. Egypt remained the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, sending grain to feed Rome's growing population. But something intangible was lost. Egypt had been a great power for 3,000 years, an independent civilization with its own character, its own identity, its own place in the world. Now, it was a province, ruled from abroad for the first time in its long history. Cleopatra had fought to prevent this. She had used every weapon at her disposal: her intelligence, her charm, her wealth, her political skill. She had allied with the most powerful Romans, had borne their children, had offered Egypt's resources in exchange for protection. In the end, it wasn't enough. The forces of history were against her. Rome was too strong, too unified, too determined, and the particular circumstances of the Roman civil war meant that Egypt's alliance with Antony, which had seemed so promising, ended in disaster. Reflections. As we come to the end of this long story, what can we say about Cleopatra? What should we remember about this woman who lived more than 2,000 years ago? First, we should remember that she was intelligent and educated, perhaps the most learned of the Ptolemaic monarchs. She spoke multiple languages. She wrote treatises on various subjects. She engaged with the philosophical and cultural movements of her time. She was not merely beautiful or charming, she was genuinely intellectual. Second, we should remember that she was politically skilled. She navigated the complex and dangerous world of late Republican Roman politics with considerable success. She formed alliances with the most powerful men in Rome. She maintained her position through palace coups and civil wars. She ruled Egypt for more than 20 years. This required not just luck, but genuine political acumen. Third, we should remember that she was courageous. When faced with defeat and capture, she chose to die on her own terms. She did not try to save herself by betraying Antony or surrendering to Octavian. She maintained her dignity to the end. Fourth, we should remember that she was human. She made mistakes. Her alliance with Antony, while reasonable given the information available to her, proved disastrous. Her presence at the Battle of Actium was a strategic error that gave Octavian propaganda ammunition. She may have been too confident in her ability to charm and manipulate Roman leaders, underestimating Roman prejudices against powerful women and foreign queens. Finally, we should remember that she was unlucky. She lived in a time of tremendous upheaval and change. The old order was collapsing and a new order was being born. She tried to find a place for Egypt in this new world, but circumstances conspired against her. If Antony had won at Actium, if the Roman civil war had ended differently, Cleopatra might be remembered as the queen who saved Egypt and restored its power. Instead, she is remembered as the last pharaoh, the woman who presided over Egypt's final loss of independence. But she is remembered. That is its own kind of immortality. For more than 2,000 years, people have been fascinated by Cleopatra, have told her story, have tried to understand her. She has become a legend, larger than life, shaped by the imaginations of countless writers and artists. The historical Cleopatra, the woman who actually lived, is obscured by layers of myth and propaganda and fantasy. Yet even through all these layers, something of the real woman shines through. We can perceive her intelligence, her charm, her political skill, her courage. We can understand the choices she made and the circumstances that constrained her. We can see her as a human being, caught up in events beyond her control, trying to do her best for her country and her family. Closing thoughts. Tonight, we have journeyed back across more than 2 millennia to the late Ptolemaic court, to Alexandria in its twilight glory, to the final flowering of Hellenistic civilization. We have followed the life of Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra, from her birth into the purple, through her education and her rise to power, through her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, through the civil wars that tore the Roman world apart, to her final defiant choice to die free rather than live captive. We have seen how she tried to preserve Egypt's independence in a world dominated by Rome, how she used intelligence and charm and political skill to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman civil war. We have seen how she nearly succeeded, how for a time it seemed that she might create a new Eastern Empire with Alexandria as its capital, with her and Antony ruling a domain that stretched from Egypt to Armenia. And we have seen how it all came crashing down at Actium, how Octavian's victory there doomed not just Antony and Cleopatra, but the entire Ptolemaic kingdom, the entire Hellenistic world. We have seen how Cleopatra chose to die on her own terms, dressed in her royal robes, ending her life with the dignity befitting a queen. Her story reminds us that history is shaped not just by vast, impersonal forces, economic trends, technological changes, the rise and fall of empires, but also by individuals, by people making choices in difficult circumstances. Cleopatra's choices mattered. If she had made different decisions, the history of the ancient world might have been different. Her story also reminds us of the power of propaganda and myth. What we think we know about Cleopatra comes largely from sources that were hostile to her, that portrayed her as a dangerous seductress threatening Rome. Modern historians have worked to separate fact from propaganda, to reconstruct the real woman from the legend. But the legend remains powerful, perhaps more powerful than the historical reality. As we sit here in the quiet dark, far removed from the ancient world, we can still hear echoes of that long-ago drama played out on the shores of the Mediterranean. We can still sense the desperation of those final days in Alexandria, when Antony and Cleopatra knew that the end was coming, when they held their banquets and called themselves those who will die together. We can imagine the moment when Cleopatra, trapped in her tomb with no escape possible, made her final choice. We can imagine her dressing in her royal robes, arranging herself on her golden couch, preparing to die as she had lived, as a queen. And we can reflect on what it means that her name has survived, that her story has been told and retold across 2,000 years, that she has become one of the most famous women in history. In some sense, she achieved a kind of immortality, not the immortality she sought, a restored Ptolemaic kingdom, a dynasty continuing through her children, but immortality nonetheless. The Ptolemaic kingdom is gone. The Hellenistic world is gone. The Roman Republic that Cleopatra knew is gone. But Cleopatra herself remains, not just in history books, but in the human imagination, a figure of romance and tragedy, of intelligence and beauty, of power and defeat. As we let these images fade and return to our own time, we carry with us the memory of this remarkable woman, the last great pharaoh of Egypt, who played for the highest stakes with the most powerful men in the world, and nearly won. We carry the reminder that individuals matter in history, that intelligence and courage can shine even in defeat, and that some people, through their lives and their choices and their legends, achieve a kind of immortality that outlasts kingdoms and empires. Rest well tonight, and let the story of Cleopatra, queen, scholar, mother, lover, pharaoh, drift through your dreams, a reminder of a world long vanished but never entirely forgotten. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, exploring the life and legacy of Cleopatra. May you find peace in the knowledge that her story, like all great stories, continues to live and breathe across the centuries, speaking to something eternal in the human experience.